Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself wondering how ancient traditions, some going back, well, thousands of years, truly stand up against the forces of big change? Like new technology or totally different ways of doing business. Do these old ways just vanish, or do they find surprising new ways to survive and adapt?
That's a truly fascinating question, and it gets right to the heart of how societies evolve, doesn't it? Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that. We're focusing on traditional rural systems in India, specifically the Jajmani system and the broader institution of caste.
Right, and we've got some incredible sources guiding us. We'll look at a real-life study from a village in Karnataka, and then two really thought-provoking papers by the famous sociologist M.N. Srinivas.
Yeah, solid stuff.
Our mission today is to pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising ones, from these materials. You're going to hear about unexpected facts, some challenging ideas, and hopefully some real aha moments about how societies adapt or, resist adaptation when faced with change.
So, what does this all mean for understanding tradition versus modernity? Let's find out.
Okay, to start, let's get a clearer picture of what Jajmani actually means. It's a term for traditional relationships in farming communities, especially those involving services passed down through families. But it's often misunderstood, right? What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, it's really interesting here is how researchers like W.H. Weiser first systematically described it way back in the 1930s. And while the specific term Jajmani mostly applies to Hindi-speaking parts of India, the system itself is widespread.
Oh, right.
It's known by different local names like Adad in Karnataka, where a village study is from, or Marai in Telugu country. So yeah, don't let the name fool you. This kind of relationship is, well, a pretty big part of traditional rural India.
That's a key clarification. It's not just a regional thing yet. Now, another important point. Is Jajmani only about religious services, or does it include other kinds of work too? Like, is it just priests?
That raises an important question. Some scholars tried to limit it just to religious services, but the broader and I think more accurate view includes everyday practical services too. Things like carpentry or blacksmithing.
Okay.
And the people living in these communities, they often saw both types of services as part of the system. In fact, some specialists even provided both religious and everyday services as part of their Jajmani role.
Ah,
These exchanges usually happen between landowning families, the patrons, and the service providers. And payments were typically made yearly in kind like grain and animal feed. And land ownership is really important here because if a patron didn't own land, they'd just pay cash. And that, well, that didn't really count as Jajmani. It's about a specific kind of exchange tied to land.
interesting. So broader than just ritual and directly tied to land. We often hear traditional and assume unchanging or hereditary for life. But does hereditary here really mean forever? Can it change? What do you think, listener?
That's a great point. While Jajmani relationships often seem hereditary, passed down parent to child, they aren't strictly fixed forever. They haven't just stayed the same for centuries. We shouldn't confuse them with just any old, long-standing employer-employee relationship.
Right.
The essential difference for Jajmani is that being part of a specific caste is crucial, whether you're the patron or the service provider. And here's a kicker. The system has always been quite flexible, actually.
Flexible. How so?
Well, new members could join, old ones could be excluded, specialists might replace or even compete with each other, payment methods could shift over time. It's a living system, you see, not some frozen picture from the past.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yes.
Let's ground this in a real place then. We're going to talk about Rajapura, a village about 60 kilometers from Bangalore in Karnataka, studied back in the late 1970s. It had about 1,000 people, 12 different castes, with the Okaligas, landowning caste, being the most powerful, gives us a concrete look.
Yeah, good case study. And a major game changer for Rajapura was the arrival of sericulture. That's silkworm rearing after 1967. This wasn't just a small shift, it transformed things. It went from being a minor activity in the slow farming seasons to a huge source of regular cash income.
Regular cash, wow.
Especially for farmers growing crops on dry land because silkworm cocoons could be harvested and sold every 2 months, a steady flow of money.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me and maybe a bit surprising. Sericulture is incredibly labor intensive, right? Especially for women. So what happened in Rajapura? This led to a shortage of agricultural workers in the village.
Exactly. A shortage.
So instead of the new technology breaking down old relationships, it actually caused some traditional things like tenancy, renting land, and sharecropping to reappear, even after land reforms. And older forms of tied labor continued or revived. Wages even went up. What does this tell you about how a new technology impacts things? Does new always mean old disappears?
Precisely. You might expect new tech to just sweep away the old ways, but in Rajapura, it actually reinforced some of them. The huge demand for labor meant that those traditional ties, which kind of guaranteed workers, became even more valuable.
Huh?
And the new technology also significantly increased demand for local craftspeople. Basket makers for the silkworm trays, potters for watering, ironsmiths, carpenters for tools. Farmers chose to keep using the local craftspeople they knew rather than buying, say, cheaper mass-produced goods from cities.
Well, it's stuck with the local guys.
Yeah. And this was so strong that it even stopped and reversed the trend of people from artisan families moving away from the village.
Fascinating. So the system wasn't just collapsing under modernization. Let's talk about the specific Adad system in Rajapura, their local term for Jajmani.
Yeah.
The study looked at services in three main groups. Can you give us a snapshot of how some of these roles adapted? Maybe start with the village-oriented ones.
Absolutely. The study gives us a great look. So first you had village-oriented services. These specialists served the whole village, and a key point is they often received land for their services, which was a very stable form of payment.
Land, right. More secure than grain sometimes.
Definitely. Take the village servant, or thodi. This role was held by members of the Madiga caste, historically considered untouchable. The thodi had a huge range of duties, assisting the headman, making announcements with a drum, being a watchman, even removing dead cattle. Now, the government officially abolished this office, but guess what? Thodis continued to serve.
Why? How did that work?
Well, several reasons. They had been granted land for their service generations ago, so there was that incentive. There was also strong pressure from village elders who wanted to keep things stable, keep the system running. And there was even a local saying, a village without a thodi is like a jungle.
Wow. So tradition, land, and community pressure kept it going.
Exactly. It shows this powerful persistence, even against modern law, because of practical reasons and, well, social inertia.
That's remarkable. What about roles that adapted more to individual families? The second group.
Right. The second group was family-oriented services. These specialists worked for specific households. They were typically paid with fixed amounts of grain and straw, but usually no land grants.
Okay.
Consider the blacksmiths. The village had 3 blacksmith families, and interestingly, they faced competition from new smiths coming in. This shows again that Jajmani, even though it seemed hereditary, could be quite flexible.
Right. Competition means it wasn't totally locked down.
Exactly. Their main job was making and repairing farm tools. Traditionally, they were paid in grain based on how many plows a farmer owned, but this became less strict over time. And crucially, sericulture boosted demand for new kinds of tools. And for these new tools, the smiths started charging cash.
Ah, so mixing payments. Cash for new stuff, maybe grain for the old.
Pretty much. It shows how new economic opportunities led to flexible payment methods within the existing framework. Then there was the barber. He actually traveled daily from a nearby village. He served most castes, though not the Harijins in Rajapura itself, paid annually with grain and straw. Now, even though younger men were increasingly going to town barbers, many patrons stuck with him. Why?
Convenience. Tradition.
Both. Convenience was big, having him come to the village, and also traditional beliefs, like the need for a ritual bath after a haircut, which maybe felt more right when done traditionally. So convenience and cultural practice helped this traditional service persist despite alternatives.
Makes sense. So some adapted payment, others persisted, partly due to convenience and belief. What about the third group, the ones blurring the lines between village and family?
Right, village and family-oriented services. The washerman is a good example here. They had duties to the whole village, like helping with deity processions, but also specific tasks for individual households, like cleaning certain types of clothes. They faced competition too, but continued, paid in both cash and kind.
And the musicians.
Ah, yes, the musicians, a team of halayas and marigos. They played at village festivals and funerals. But interestingly, for weddings, villagers started hiring professional musicians from towns.
Why the shift for weddings specifically?
2 main reasons came up. Modern music preferences, people wanted newer styles, and also just practical stuff. Often, multiple weddings happened on the same day, and the traditional team couldn't be everywhere. So this shows a clear case where changing tastes and practical needs led to a decline in one specific part of a traditional role while other parts continued.
Okay, so putting it all together from Rajapura,
Yeah.
what's the big picture here? Did sericulture, this big technological and economic shift, completely break down those traditional attitudes of mutual dependence, like some theories might predict?
Well, if we connect this study to the bigger picture, the answer from Rajapura seems to be a pretty resounding no. Sericulture definitely brought more cash into the village economy, monetization increased, no doubt. But it didn't just destroy those traditional relationships of mutual dependence. In fact, in many ways, it kept service specialists busy, even busier year round.
So the system adapted rather than broke.
Exactly. The Jajmani system, or Adade there, adapted. It showed incredible flexibility. We saw hereditary succession wasn't always rigid, payment formulas shifted, cash payments for new services popped up right alongside traditional grain payments.
Why do you think both sides, the patrons, the landowning families, and the specialists, continued these relationships, even when there were other options or maybe payments were sometimes late, as the study mentioned? What's the practical advantage for them, listener?
That's a great question for you to consider. For patrons, the landowners, having local specialists was just incredibly convenient. It meant personal relationships, often leading to more reliable work, services available at the beck and call whenever needed.
All right, easier than finding someone new each time.
And it was also often simpler for farmers to pay in grain they already had, rather than having to sell grain for cash just to pay someone. For the specialists, these roles provided a baseline income, often supplementing what they earned doing other work, like farm labor.
Okay, so income security.
Yeah, and there was also the satisfaction, the social status, that came from upholding family and caste traditions. And importantly, don't forget the village leaders. They played a crucial role, often stepping in to settle arguments or prevent relationships from breaking down completely. They often wanted to keep the status quo.
Maintaining stability.
Exactly. It really makes you think about the enduring power of tradition, doesn't it? How it can absorb new things, adapt, and persist for very practical reasons.
Definitely. Okay, let's zoom out now to the broader institution of caste itself, drawing from M.N. Srinivas. In a paper from 1955, he asked a very direct question. Can castes exist in the India of tomorrow? He looked at it from two angles. Should they exist? And are they likely to exist? What was his initial take on whether they should disappear?
Well, he noted something quite striking. Only a tiny fraction of people in India, back then anyway, truly wanted the caste system to vanish completely. The vast majority, especially in rural areas, didn't. For them, caste provided concrete benefits, a network of kin, friends, a shared culture. He even suggested it functioned almost like a social safety net, a sort of welfare system in some ways.
So not something people were eager to give up easily.
Not at all. And this presented a huge challenge for reformers. How do you convince people to abandon something that feels beneficial or necessary?
And then there's this gap he pointed out between talk and practice. Many leaders publicly spoke against caste, advocating for a casteless society. But their actions often suggested otherwise.
Right. Like choosing government ministers based on caste calculations to secure votes. It became a tool in politics. Even universal adult voting rights, which you might think would weaken caste, seemed to actually strengthen it in some ways by making it a ready-made basis for political groups and representation.
So what did Srinivas conclude about the sheer strength of this institution back then?
He was pretty blunt. He said it had prodigious strength, immense power, and wouldn't die easily. He acknowledged that laws against untouchability did have some effect, mainly because educated people from marginalized groups, Dalits or Harijans, fought to enforce them. But this often led to increased tension, even violence. Srinivas suggested rather grimly that this kind of struggle was perhaps a necessary step for those constitutional rights to actually become real on the ground. It wasn't going to be a smooth transition.
A painful process. Now, fast forward to a later paper from 1999, Srinivas makes an even bolder claim. He argues that the traditional caste-based system of production, how basic needs were met, is rapidly breaking down. The end of a millennia-old social order. How does this connect to Jajmani and what we saw in Rajapura?
This is a really crucial distinction he makes. Historically, village economies were very local, cash was minimal, economic relationships were deeply embedded in social life, often inherited, multi-stranded, based on more than just work. Hierarchy was expressed through ideas of ritual purity, yes, but also very practically through land ownership. This led to the idea of dominant castes, those owning most land, having numerical strength and thus village control.
And bonded labor was part of that old system too.
Yes, tied labor, often linked to debt, was another feature. Legally banned, but aspects of it persisted. This entire traditional system of how people produced and exchanged goods and services was fundamentally built on caste roles.
So the big shift Srinivas identifies later is From status to contract, right? Moving from inherited roles fixed by birth to more market-driven transactions. Is that the core change he saw happening?
Precisely. He argued that this system, where your economic role was largely fixed by your caste status, was on its way out. Why? Because of new technologies and modern institutions, influenced first by British rule and then massively accelerated by independent India's goals of democracy, equality, and social justice after 1950.
Can you give some examples of those impacts?
Sure, think about new technologies and products. Mass-produced cooking oils started replacing the traditional oil presser caste's role. Plastic and aluminum pots replaced traditional clay ones made by potters. Factory tiles replaced local tilers. Refined sugar replaced locally made gur.
Everyday things changing the economic roles.
Exactly. Even essential service providers like barbers and washermen had to adapt. They started using safety razors and modern detergents, and increasingly they were being paid in cash, not just grain. Their old methods were just becoming less relevant or efficient.
And the agricultural changes.
Right, the agricultural revolutions. The Green Revolution brought high-yielding crops and intensive farming. This boosted production hugely, but sometimes disadvantaged poorer farmers who couldn't afford the new inputs. Then the White Revolution boosted dairy and poultry farming. This, along with rising food prices generally, significantly increased rural wages. And tractors started making traditional bullocks less essential for plowing, impacting related services.
And migration played a role too.
A huge role. Migration, both seasonal and long-term, from poorer areas to richer ones or to cities, became much more common. This was driven partly by population growth, but also by the breakdown of the old Jajmani system itself, which meant people had to look elsewhere for work. All these forces together started loosening those traditional inherited ties between caste and occupation.
So with all these dramatic changes, technology, agriculture, migration, cash economy, what does this mean for caste itself? Is it just disappearing because the economic system it was built on is crumbling? What do you think, listeners, at the end of the story?
Well, this is where we hit the central paradox, and it's really the key takeaway from Srinivas's later work. He argued that yes, better communication, more education, government affirmative action, political organizing, technological change, all these have greatly weakened the direct link between a person's caste, their jati, and their traditional occupation.
The economic link is breaking.
Right. Economic relationships are becoming freer, more market-based. However, and this is the crucial part.
The paradox. Go on.
While caste as a system is dead or dying, individual castes are, in his words, thriving.
Thriving. How can that be if the system is dying?
Because the nature of caste is changing. The old idea of a fixed hierarchy where one group is inherently superior to another based on ritual purity has lost much of its legitimacy. Instead, it's being replaced by a focus on difference and group identity. What we see now is individual castes organizing horizontally people from the same caste across different villages or regions coming together. Why?
For power. Resources.
Exactly. To compete for political power, economic opportunities, government jobs, spots in education. This is especially clear in how lower castes and Dalits, armed with new ideas of human dignity and equality from democracy and education, are asserting their rights. This assertion often leads to conflict with the traditionally dominant castes, unfortunately, but it shows caste transforming into a basis for identity politics and competition, not just disappearing.
So it's not simply vanishing, but profoundly transforming into something else, something more competitive maybe. What about historical attempts to dismantle caste, like the Bhakti movement? These were powerful religious and social movements centuries ago. Why didn't they succeed in fundamentally changing the system back then?
That's a really important historical question Srinivas addresses. Why did earlier ideological attacks from Buddhism, Jainism, and later the medieval Bhakti movements, which often preached against caste hierarchy, ultimately fail to dismantle it? His argument is essentially economic. They weren't backed by a real alternative system of production that could function without relying on caste-based labor.
They challenged the ideas, but not the underlying structure.
Pretty much. They focused primarily on challenging Brahmanical authority or the idea of inherent hierarchy. But at the village level, how people actually produced their food, tools, clothes, the economic reality remained tied to caste roles. The economic structure didn't fundamentally change, so the social structure, while perhaps ideologically challenged, largely persisted.
But now, with modern technology, new institutions, market economies, you're saying it's fundamentally different this time. There's a real economic alternative now.
Yes, that's the core argument for why change is deeper now. The combination of completely new technologies, new ways of organizing society based on principles like democracy and legal equality, and new ideologies of human dignity. This combination has been operating for a significant time now, and crucially, it's creating an alternative system of production that does ignore or actively violate the traditional caste-based division of labor. You don't need to be a certain caste to drive a tractor or work in a factory.
That makes sense. It's the economic shift underpinning the ideological one. Finally, let's touch on India's rising middle class. How do they fit into this complex picture of caste transformation?
Good question. The expanding urban middle class is a major factor. While historically dominated by upper castes, it's becoming increasingly diverse. This is thanks partly to wider access to education and also government affirmative action policies, which aim to provide opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups. And the aspiration itself, the desire for consumer goods for middle class lifestyle, is widespread, cutting across traditional caste lines.
So lifestyle and profession are becoming more important than caste for this group.
Increasingly, yes. Among the urban middle classes, things like education level, profession, income, and lifestyle are becoming more important markers of status than caste background alone. And intercaste marriages, while still not the norm everywhere, are becoming more common, especially among younger, educated urban populations. Srinivas actually suggested, perhaps optimistically, that a massive assault on mass poverty plus rapid economic growth will be the best dissolvers of caste identities.
So economic progress is the ultimate solvent.
That was his hope. The idea being that as broad-based economic opportunities expand, the rigid boundaries and relevance of traditional caste identities might lessen in daily life, replaced by class or professional identities.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up.
Sure. So to recap our deep dive, we started with the Jajmani system in Rajapura village. We saw how new technology like sericulture, perhaps surprisingly, didn't just break down those traditional relationships. Instead, it showed how adaptable the system could be, often persisting due to very practical reasons, convenience, and the strong influence of village leaders wanting stability.
Right. Adaptation, not just collapse.
Yep.
And then we zoomed out to the huge institution of caste itself, using M. N. Srinivas's insights. We saw its incredible historical strength, its prodigious strength, and how, despite legal changes and ideological challenges, it continues to shape Indian society in profound ways. The central paradox became really clear. While the traditional caste-based system of production is indeed breaking down due to modern forces, technology, markets, new institutions.
The economic base is eroding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But individual castes themselves are not disappearing. Instead, they're transforming, flexing, finding new life, even thriving in new competitive ways within a democratic framework, asserting identity, competing for resources.
Yeah, it demonstrates powerfully that social change is rarely a simple linear process, is it? Old structures don't just vanish neatly. They evolve, they twist, sometimes in very surprising directions, intertwining with new forces. Understanding these nuanced ways societies change is, well, it's crucial.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a really thought-provoking idea for you, the listener, to consider. If caste as a rigid hierarchical system is dying, but individual castes are still very much alive, maybe even strengthening as identity groups for political or economic gain, what does a truly equal and maybe casteless India look like in the future? Is that even the right goal anymore, or is it about managing difference fairly? And what role do you think continued technological advancements and changing social values will play in this slow, often difficult, sometimes bleeding, as Srinivas put it, revolution? It's a conversation that is very much still unfolding, and hopefully after this deep dive, you feel much better informed to understand its many complex layers.